Hey, what's up, guys? A little reading today. Chapter 6 Infamy. Yawata was a small city situated in the south of Japan, known locally for its iron and steel works. There was little else in Yawata to distinguish it from any other small Japanese city, but Yawata was different. Yawata had the unwanted distinction of becoming the first Japanese city attacked by American B-29 bombers in the summer of 1944. Unfortunately, Yawata also had the unwanted distinction of being one of the last cities attacked by B-29s in the summer of 1945. The first raid on Yawata was a failure, with only one high-explosive bomb landing anywhere near the prime target. The last raid, however, was an overwhelming success. In August 1945, over 200 B-29 bombers dropped thousands of firebombs on Yawata and left most of the city a smoking ruin. Early the following day after the last raid, August 9th, a single B-29 was flying high above the neighboring Japanese city of Kokura. The large four-engine plane circled for several minutes, apparently looking for something below. Because the city was totally obscured by the smoke drifting in from the Yawata firebombing raid of the day before, it was decided to ignore Kokura altogether and fly to the next name on the list. 20 minutes later, the B-29 found itself high over the secondary target. But again, the city below was obscured, this time not by drifting smoke but by a heavy cloud cover. The aircraft, low on fuel, continued to circle nervously several times, hoping for an opening in the clouds. Finally, just as the pilot was about to give up and bank for home, the bombardier saw a tiny break in the clouds. Frantically looking for landmarks that would help locate their position above the target, the airmen at last identified one, a church, a Christian church, the largest Christian church in East Asia. Inside the cathedral, directly below, a large mass is being held this day. With a great sense of relief, the entire crew of the B-29 prepared to drop their payload, a single though huge bomb. In a moment, the bomb bay doors opened. Below, through the brief hole in the clouds, lay the beautiful church and the beautiful city of Nagasaki. 3 days previous, on August 6, 1945, the bomb bay doors of another B-29 had opened wide to drop another single but huge bomb, this one over Hiroshima. Although virtually every Japanese city had been scorched from the face of the earth by American firebombing raids, a handful of cities had hardly been touched. Kokura and Nagasaki were two of them. Hiroshima was another. Rumors abounded in all the spared cities as to why, when all else had been leveled, they were not. Nowhere were the rumors more pronounced than in the unscathed city of Hiroshima. Some speculated that because many Hiroshima residents had immigrated to the U.S. before, there was a special relationship with the Americans, an unspoken understanding, a mystical meeting of hearts and minds of Asian and Anglo. Others imagined that Hiroshima must be home to some very important Americans, including President Truman's mother. Still more theorized that the reason the city was spared when all else was destroyed was due to the fact that Hiroshima, like Nagasaki, was home to a large Christian community. In any case, whatever the cause, most people felt that their city's salvation was nothing short of a miracle. Perhaps even a few felt for the first time in the war, with Japan's collapse clearly looming, with peace close at hand, that the Americans were displaying a hint of human mercy for the soon-to-be defeated. With war ending, with emotions easing, with tempers cooling, surely many leaders in America were looking ahead to a better day, a day when war was replaced by peace, when hate was replaced by mercy. But of course, none of the above was so. There was no mercy in the heart of Americans for the Japanese, just as there had been none for the Germans. Fury over Pearl Harbor, the Bataan Death March, the mistreatment of American POWs, and anger over a long list of real or rumored war crimes was fully as great, perhaps even greater, than when the war began in 1941. Hence, when Harry Truman found out about the new weapon, there was never the slightest doubt. Following the initial test of the wonder weapon in the desert of New Mexico, the new American president read the reports and saw the film of the detonation. He was ecstatic. "We have discovered the most terrible bomb in the history of the world," Truman excitedly wrote in his diary. "This weapon is to be used against Japan between now and August 10th. I have told the Secretary of War, Mr. Henry Stimson, to use it so that military objectives and soldiers and sailors are the target and not women and children. Even if the Japs are savages, ruthless, merciless, and fanatic, we as the leader of the world for the common welfare cannot drop this terrible bomb on civilians." Well, Truman, with a cocked eye to the future publication and posterity, scratching his diary was one thing, but what he actually thought and did was something else. As Truman well knew when he gave his approval, all the targets selected for the new weapons were cities crowded with women and children, and not forts filled with soldiers, nor harbors crammed with sailors. Additionally, the American president seemed to have no qualms whatsoever in ordering the non-stop firebombing raids of Japanese cities, resulting in the nightly massacre of thousands of civilians. In fairness to Truman, his open hatred of the Japanese was merely a manifestation of those around him, including a significant percentage of the American population. Long after the Pearl Harbor attack of 1941, such was the hatred felt for the sneaky Japs. By almost all Americans, there was virtually no opposition to the continued imprisonment of well over 100,000 Japanese Americans in remote concentration camps, even years after it was clear the prisoners posed no threat and the U.S. would easily win the war. Even when it was obvious to all that Japan was be defeated, a 1944 opinion poll found a significant percentage of the U.S. public still favored the utter extermination of all Japanese men, women, and children across the board. Bug spray, rat traps, and other similar products sold to the American public were advertised as great ways to kill insects, rodents, and Japs. Hollywood movies continue to portray Japanese soldiers and airmen as laughing, psychotic sadists who enjoy torturing captives and machine gunning defenseless civilians for sport. Japan should be cast out from the world family of nations, announced a Florida congressman in 1943. There is no place for mad dogs. The only way to beat the Japs is to kill them all, reasoned the naval commander. They will not surrender, and our troops are taking no chances and are killing them anyway. Apparently, the atrocities by the Japs have never been told in the U.S. Air Force General Henry Arnold angrily wrote in June 1945, with babies being thrown up in the air and caught on bayonets, autopsies on living people, burning prisoners to death by sprinkling them with gasoline. There is no feeling of sparing any Japs here, men, women, or children. Gas, fire, anything to exterminate the entire race exemplifies the feeling. They are not pretty stories, but they explain why the Jap can expect anything. And thus to mirror American sentiment, to prove to U.S. voters that he filled his shoes and followed the footsteps of the late, lamented FDR. Harry Truman was willing to use anything against the Japs. Anything. The morning of August 6, 1945, doctors and nurses were quietly beginning their normal duties at the downtown Hiroshima hospital. Since their city had been spared the horrors of war and firebombing, the 80 patients being treated here this particular morning were typical of virtually any hospital in the world: broken legs, cancer, childbirth, old age. At 8:15 a.m., 2,000 feet directly above the hospital, the bomb exploded. There was a blinding brightness like 1,000 suns. In a fraction of a second, all those inside the hospital, doctors, nurse, patients, were vaporized. They simply disappeared. Hundreds on the streets outside like the hospital likewise vanished in a 10,000-degree flash. In some cases, there was a dark shadow on the floor or wall where a human had been. In most cases, nothing. Further away, 200 yards or more, victims were instantly carbonized in their tracks. In a flash, humans and animals were transformed into what seemed burnt logs. If a victim happened to be walking, running, exercising, or merely standing or sitting at that precise fraction of a second, just so they were carbonized in death. Still further along, several hundred yards, the eyeballs of humans and horses alike melted and poured down faces that were no longer faces. Noses, mouths, ears, chins, as well as breasts, hands, fingers, feet all vanished in a blink. Then in the moment, the great deafening boom. In another moment, the blast of a fiery, furious 400-mile-per-hour wind. Virtually everything standing. Hospital, buildings, shops, streetcars, towers, light poles, trees, humans, animals, all were broiled and flattened. Hundreds of blackened bodies were flung into the river. Further along half a mile, the wind ripped clothing from people. The heat burned off hair and fused fingers together. The old, the young, dogs, cats, birds, all were blown away like burning leaves. Homes exploded. Broken glass, nails, and splinters shredded flesh. Those inside who then quickly died from blood loss. And above everything, a towering, churning cloud of fire. Smoke, dirt, and sand billowed and boiled madly, completely obscuring the blue sky of only a few seconds before. Further still, a mile from the blast center, those who had survived yet had not sensed the excruciating pain to come. From their hideous burns, from the glass and wood embedded in their heads and bodies, from the sand and mud filling their mouths, from the skin hanging from their naked cells like sheets, These victims thought that a bomb had exploded right at their feet, or often many felt that the earth had opened up below and that hell itself had been unleashed on the world. Just over a mile from the blast, 33-year-old housewife Futaba Kiriyama had been working with a group of volunteers as they helped create city fire breaks just in case some night they were visited by the fire-raining Bisan. The explosion buried Futaba under debris. Finally, I did manage to crawl free. There was a terrible smell in the air. Thinking that the bomb hit us might have been a yellow phosphorus incendiary, like those that had fallen on so many other cities, I rubbed my nose and mouth hard with a towel I had at my waist. To my horror, I found that the skin of my face had come off in the towel. Oh, the skin on my hands, on my arms came off too. From elbows to fingertips, all the skin on my right arm had come loose and was hanging grotesquely. The skin of my left hand fell off too, the 5 fingers like a glove. I found myself sitting on the ground prostrate. Gradually, I registered that all my companions had disappeared. What had happened to them? A frantic panic gripped me. I wanted to run, but where? Around me was just debris, wooden framing, beams, and roofing tiles. There wasn't a single landmark left. What happened to that sky so blue a moment ago? Now it was as black as night. Everything seemed vague and fuzzy. It was though as a cloud covered my eyes, and I wondered if I had lost my senses. Yet further, people were knocked off their feet by flying debris as their homes collapsed around them. Those who were only slightly injured and could free themselves from the rubble were initially confused. Virtually all were certain that something terrible had happened, but most imagined it had happened to they and they alone. Soon as an enormous mushroom-shaped cloud, boiling black and red, high above Hiroshima, surviving mothers and fathers, surviving husbands and wives. All thought not of themselves and the injuries, but of those they loved, who lived, worked, or went to school in the city center. The hundreds of stunned survivors were mere minutes after the blast of heat and wind began walking, in some cases running towards Hiroshima. So in these days, people tried to reach the city and encountered those terribly injured survivors trying to escape the city. And what they saw was their worst nightmare. In absolute silence, many of those fleeing Hiroshima approached in shreds of clothing, bloody, staggering, arms stretched as if reaching for something that was not there. Still more limped along, utterly nude, their bodies raw and swollen with enormous blisters. Then came the others. They all had skin blackened by burns, remembered one man. They had no hair, and at a glance you couldn't tell whether we were looking at them, in front or in back. Many of them died along the road. They didn't look like people of this world. They resembled living pieces of charcoal, wandering mindlessly until they collapsed and died, recalled another horrified witness. As the would-be rescuers moved further into the totally destroyed city, the hideous sights and horror only increased. I saw people burned from head to foot, eyeless and grotesquely disfigured, said Tomio Yoshida, a young soldier recently arrived in Hiroshima. A woman who had gone mad embraced a hot water bottle as if it were an infant. Adhering to a crumbling wall, I saw a piece of white medical coat. The only trace of the doctor who had worn it was a dark rubber-like patch that had once been his head. Mothers tried to breastfeed dying infants. Infants tried to feed from dead mothers. A man holding his own eyeball. Birds hopping on the ground because their wings were burned off. Horses yet on fire, screaming in their death agony. People standing like black statues, burned to carbon. Carbonized legs still standing, without bodies. Ghostly shadows on walls and streets of traffic police, vendors and children, all vaporized. I finally saw the Tsurumi Bridge and ran headlong toward it, jumping over piles of rubble, recalled Futaba Kiriyama when she finally found the strength to move. What I saw under the bridge then horrified me. People by the hundreds were flailing in the river. I couldn't tell if they were men or women. They were all the same state. Their faces were puffy and ashen. Their hair tangled, they held their hands raised and groaning with pain, threw themselves into the water. I had a violent impulse to do so myself because of the pain burning through my own body, but I can't swim and I held back. The stunned woman wandered until she finally reached the parade ground. Around me on the parade ground were a number of grade school and secondary school children, boys and girls, writhing in spasms of agony. I heard them cry, "Mama, Mama," as though they had gone crazy. They were so burned and bloody that looking at them was insupportable. I forced myself to do just the same, and I cried out in rage, "Why? Why these children?" But there was no one to rage at. and I could do nothing but watch them die, one after the other, vainly calling for their mothers. When I reached the local elementary school, recounted Toshiko Sakei, a 26-year-old mother desperately searching for her children, people were jammed in the hallways. Everywhere was filled with moans and groans and sobs and cries. I couldn't find any of my family, so I went out to the playground. There were 4 piles of bodies, and I stood in front of them. I just didn't know what to do. How could I find the bodies of my beloved ones? When I was going through the classrooms, I could take a look at each person, but these were mounds. If I tried to find my beloved ones, I would have to remove the bodies one by one. It just wasn't possible. I really felt sad. There were all kinds of bodies in the mounds. Not only human bodies, but bodies of birds, cats, dogs, and even that of a cow. It looked horrible. I can't find words to describe it. They were burned, just like human bodies, and some of them were half burnt. There was even a swollen horse. Just everything was there, everything.